Welcome back to the Business Immigration Benchmark. I'm your host, Laura Blanaires. This week, we're going to have a bite-sized episode. It's been a busy start of the month here at WR Immigration, but I wanted to get an episode out and thought an important topic to touch base on again is the H-1B lottery. Now, I know we spent a lot of time on the H-1B cap lottery in previous episodes, so I'll only briefly walk through the facts and figures released from USCIS regarding the number of total registrations, eligible registrations, as well as the selection rate. We'll use that to dive into comparing it to previous years, as well as what to expect in the years to come. So we'll dive into that in just a moment. But before we do that, I love getting questions, comments, suggestions for future episodes from listeners. So for those of you who have emailed, DM'd me on LinkedIn, thank you. For those of you who haven't, this is your call. Please send me a note through LinkedIn or email about what you'd like to see, questions you have in the U.S. immigration space that I can dive into on a deeper level here on the Business Immigration Benchmark. So with that, we'll dive right in. Okay, so analyzing the numbers from this recent USCIS drop of data from H-1B cap registration. As expected, as a result of the new beneficiary-centric system USCIS rolled out, there were about 480,000 total registration this year. And that's compared to last year where there were 780,000. So that's a decrease of 38% and puts us back into the registration numbers from 2 years ago. The big change was in the number of folks who had multiple registrations submitted on their behalf by 2 or more companies. Last year, that number was around 409,000. And this year, we saw just about 47,000 beneficiaries with multiple registrations. So that's a nearly 90% overall decrease in folks who had multiple registrations. So that's exactly what USCIS was hoping would happen because there's no advantage to multiple registrations. The beneficiary does not have any advantage when a company or multiple companies submit multiple registrations on their behalf. So that's why, a 90% overall decrease in multiple registration occurred because there is, again, no benefit. So behavior matches what they were incentivizing. Last year was a bit wonky because the fraud issues that USCIS corrected for, and they didn't provide very transparent information to the public on how many individuals in total were selected in the lottery, were stripped of that selection due to fraud allegations. So that's the X factor here. We don't know how many registrations were revoked or denied when the beneficiary and the petitioner went forward with the filing. USCIS initially selected about 110,000 registrations initially in the lottery last year, but ultimately selected a total of 188,000 out of a pool of 760,000 eligible registrations. So that's all to say that I get a question a lot about, will there be a second lottery poll for this year? And I think when I look at the numbers, based on the selected registrants this year was just over 120,000 selected registrants. Comparing that to 2023, which is probably the best estimate given that the numbers are most similar. In 2023, the government polled 127,000 total. And so I think that number, and combined with layoffs we saw from big H-1B users like Tesla recently, I think it's likely or more probable than I thought on the onset that there may be a second lottery poll. So when I was having these conversations on the onset, before we saw these numbers, I was saying not likely to have a second lottery poll, but I do think it's more likely given the numbers. But I will say the X factor here is we don't know how many registrations or, selections were ultimately revoked or denied because of fraud allegations. I will say that there are some litigators out there defending H-1B workers who received H-1B cap selections last year that USCIS denied or rejected the filing. And then from the public updates available for these cases, for these H-1B visa lottery, multiple revocations, they are proceeding in federal court. So it's looking optimistic from what I'm reading that these H-1B workers will have their denials overturned. I don't know how that plays into, this year's numbers, but that's all to say what we don't have revealed from any previous years is how many petitions USCIS revoked or denied for allegations of multiple registrations or fraud. And I bring that up because if I'm suggesting that there might be a second lottery or more selections, it's based off of how many I'm seeing in previous years of total selections and kind of a guesstimate that if that fraud allegation was low, there may be another lottery poll. Although it might not be many, I think there's still a likelihood that they would do a second poll, and that would happen in July. The final sort of fact and figure here is the initial selection rate last year was just under 15%, but ultimately at the conclusion of the H-1B lottery cycle last year was a total of 25% selection rate. So initially it was very low. We had some really difficult conversations, a lot of contingency planning, only to end up with a 25% overall. This year, like I said, about 120,000 registrants were selected from a pool of 470,000 eligible registration, which evens out to about an overall 25% selection rate. So where we ended up on this initial lottery pool is ultimately the final selection rate of last year. So approximately 1 in 4 was the rate of selection. But it is a huge relief this year for a higher initial selection rate, because if you had a population or anybody who was a sort of last chancer in the H-1B lottery, it's better to know their selection immediately so they can secure the cap gap relief. So we've, like I said, had a busy month here at WR Immigration filing those cap gap relief cases as soon as possible. Because last year, what we saw with such a low selection rate initially was a lot of emergency contingency planning, needing to find ways for those last chancers to find another solution to stay in the U.S., only to then ultimately be selected for H-1B, but have to file their H-1B as maybe consular notification and have to travel outside the U.S. So overall, huge improvement with a higher initial selection rate of 25%. So those last chancers and just more folks just getting to know of their plans with H-1B selection early on. Okay, so what does this all mean for the future, and how should you as HR or global mobility leaders plan and strategize for future H-1B cap lottery seasons like next year? Well, first, I think it's important to point out that within the scope of its original aim to combat what were essentially over and multiple registrants in the H-1B lottery, the new beneficiary-centric system that USCIS rolled out was a success. We saw a huge decrease in multiple registrations. However, as we just noted, ultimately the chances of an employee being selected in the H-1B lottery essentially remained the same as last year, a 1 in 4 chance. Now, the benefit here was that we saw the initial selection rate as 1 in 4, as opposed to last year, which it was 2 lottery pulls to get to that same selection rate. So from a beneficiary or petitioner standpoint, much better to have that news as soon as possible to plan for your employee, your workforce. But the other thing that we've talked about before is that the rollout of technology and the platform behind the system for the H-1B registration was rocky. It was largely a burden on the legal teams and the company administrators who saw a lot of outages on the platform and errors in the system, making the actual act of registration very clunky and unfortunately duplicative. So I hope that USCIS will ensure a better user experience for next year on the platform. There are some other key factors, though, that I want to talk through that will impact what the H-1B lottery will look like next year and in the years to come. And the biggest is the election. So that's the elephant in the room. Not meaning to get political here, but the H-1B lottery next year will largely depend on who's in office. And it's not just the H-1B lottery. I mean, the U.S. immigration system as a whole will dramatically change depending on who's in office next year. If Biden's in office next year, we can expect more of the same within the H-1B lottery. We can expect slow and steady movement towards updating and upgrading the USCIS technology to be online. If Trump takes office, then he'll, in all likelihood, implement the plans that he's laid out in Project 2025. If you don't know what Project 2025 is, I certainly recommend looking it up. But for a quick and dirty on what is Project 2025, take a look at the report from Cecilia Esterline, who's with the immigration policy think tank, the Niskanen Center. She spotlights that as part of Project 2025, the Trump administration could eliminate the two lowest wage levels in the DOL wage leveling system. So for those of you who have filed H-1Bs in the past, you'll know that the Department of Labor maintains wage levels for every occupational code that it identifies. The wage levels 1 and 2 are mostly associated with entry-level positions within that occupation. And the H-1B lottery effectively serves foreign-born workers in entry-level positions. So eliminating wages 1 and 2 would make it incredibly difficult for these entry-level foreign workers to qualify for H-1B. So this is an interesting way to attack the use of the H-1B program through the use of wage leveling within DOL. So it's not changing any of the H-1B numbers, which are mandated through Congress, but rather how it's administered. I think it's fair to say that if Project 2025 were to move forward, this would get litigated. I don't think that the business immigration community would go down without a fight on this, as we've seen in past challenges within a previous Trump administration. So it would be very thorny to work through, but certainly that would challenge the ability for entry-level foreign-born workers to apply for the H-1B. The second factor to look forward in 2025 and plan for is the economy. Now, this is another topic. I'm not an expert on economics or the economy, but it does always impact how the H-1B visa lottery is used, whether there are more registrations, how companies are hiring. So we've continued to see layoffs in 2024 with some of the largest filers having layoffs or low hiring rates. And I think that definitely impacts and could continue to impact the H-1B selection rate in years to come. But it's hard to predict those things and what lies ahead. In the past years, USCIS has released some company-specific data showing how many H-1B cap approvals each company received. But I haven't seen anything like that released yet. And we'll keep an eye out to see if we can conduct on any analysis if and when that data is released by USCIS to identify any trends and report on it. The third thing I want to bring up here is fee increases. So regardless of who's in the White House in 2025, I'm almost certain that USCIS will follow through with increasing the H-1B cap registration fee from this year's $10 to $215 per applicant. This increase is certainly going to impact companies differently, but at a scale, a fee increase of over 2,050% will certainly change the equation for a company who's going to submit for which applicants. The bar to entry at $10, very low. When you ratchet that up to $215, companies may be less likely to support H-1B registrations liberally. So we might see some stricter policies about who is entered into the H-1B lottery, given that the fee is going up so dramatically. And then global alternatives. This is a big trend we've talked about in previous episodes. We'll continue to talk about. We'll bring Audrey Lustgarten, our global managing partner from WR Immigration, to chat more. But I think we're seeing more and more companies approach maintaining foreign national talent globally. So the U.S. becoming harder and harder to secure an H-1B, again, 1 in 4 selection rate. Companies are getting creative, whether it's leveraging operations abroad to send their employees to work at affiliates outside the U.S. and facilitate work permits in Canada, Ireland, wherever it might be that suits their corporate need. I've even seen companies enter into sort of contracting arrangements where they send the foreign national back to their home country and work on a contracting basis with that foreign national when they go back to their home country. So seeing a lot, but I think that overall the global trend to maintain the talent, that we're seeing more outbound movement to facilitate maintenance of that talented employee. We'll continue to see that in the years to come. So that's where we're going to wrap today. Just a brief high-level summary of the data released from USCIS's most recent cap lottery. I know you all have been in the weeds here filing H-1B cap petitions of those that were selected and working through your contingency plan. So it's been a busy month for everyone. We'll catch you next week here on the Business Immigration Benchmark.